What do we have in chapter 5? Belshazzar is going to be humbled. And this isn't going to occur until after chapter 6 and 7. But now it is given. Belshazzar is a son-in-law. The son-in-law of Nebuchadnezzar. Nabonidus became king after a couple of the other. There was a son, and he didn't last long. And it was during, right after Nebuchadnezzar, and then he's on for a little while, and then this man comes in, and he doesn't really want to be king. So extra biblical says he just basically left Babylon, and he liked to hunt. So he went out and he did some hunting in the desert and left his son Belshazzar in charge. And Belshazzar gives a great feast. Once again, this is quite a bit later. In fact, it's coming to the place where the Medes and Persians are going to take over. And he is in there giving a banquet, and he's drinking, and he sends out to get the utensils that were found in the Jewish temple that had been brought back so that he could drink from them. It seems to be his way of saying, I don't care, I am greater, I can defy other gods. Meanwhile, the Persians are at his gate. It's interesting. What would you be doing if an enemy was surrounding the city and you're inside the city? What would you be doing?
Fighting.
Fighting. At least making a few more arrows. Getting a couple more stones to throw. Putting a little more. He's having a banquet. When people get into trouble financially and they're real debt, what do they often do? Spend more money. I've actually had people who couldn't pay their bills go on a vacation. And I'm just saying, like, I'm paying my bills and I can't afford a vacation. But sometimes the guilt, the pressure, the stress becomes so much that rather than actually dealing with the issue at hand, they go in the opposite direction. You got a major paper exegetical due tomorrow. For like Dr. Dan Wallace, okay? And so so you go home to your room and you go to sleep. Really? But it just seemed like the right thing to do at the time, right? You know what I mean? I can't get it done, so I might as well sleep and gain some energy and at least feel good, you know? Sleep is actually the evangelical Christian's drug of choice. I'm convinced of that. That when I've got great responsibility, I get tired. I can't like smoke marijuana or anything like that to feel good, but sleep is a legitimate option for me. Book of Proverbs talks a great deal about that. And I just know that I need to be careful. And so here he is. He begins to boast and drinking and praising the gods of gold and silver, bronze and iron, wood and so on. Think, have you not heard about that statue that has all these different metals within it? Many people didn't think that Belshazzar was a true person. There is a number, actually, of what they call Nabonidus cylinders. Where did I put down there? Some doubted that there was a king such as Belshazzar. He wasn't included on existing lists of kings in Babylon. So, since the Babylonians didn't mention him, obviously the Bible's wrong. Rather than seeing the Bible as a legitimate, reliable, historical book, they didn't say he didn't exist, they just didn't mention him. This cylinder was found and part of the Babylonian exile. It's a record of King Nabonidus, who calls Belshazzar his firstborn son. So there were people who critiqued the book of Daniel, feeling that it was written centuries later, therefore they didn't have all the proper names and everything. But the more the research has come along, the more Daniel is established. And since apparently his son Belshazzar is ruling, then Belshazzar is only going to be able to offer Daniel the third place in the kingdom. And so all of a sudden there is handwriting on the wall. When you walk into a home and there's handwriting on the wall, you usually assume that there is a 2-year-old perhaps around there. But this here is comes supernaturally. And he can't understand what it's saying. I first thought, well, maybe it was written in Hebrew, that's why he can't understand what it's saying. But if you keep on in the chapter, it's written in Aramaic. Many, tekel, parson. If you wanted to know what this would apparently mean in a very common way, it would be a penny, a nickel, a dime. They are amounts, they are weights or amounts of value. So if all of a sudden a hand came up there and said a penny, a nickel, a dime, what would you think it meant? Well, you don't know. But if you know anything about Hebrew and Aramaic, you'll understand that the foundation of the language is the verb. And so what it really means when Daniel comes in to explain it is it doesn't just mean a cent, but it means he numbered. He numbered. He weighed it. Shekel. It's not, you're too light. And then he divides it. So it's actually, it's not the noun that's produced, it's the verb that is there. And so he doesn't know what to do. However, the queen, verse 10, hearing the voices, comes in, says, there's a man in your kingdom who has the spirit of the holy gods in him. Daniel is no longer working for the king. He's an older man. It's going to be interesting. The next kingdom that comes in, the Medes and Persians, are going to find Daniel to be an excellent worker. And they're going to put him in charge. They plan to put him in charge of the whole province pretty soon. So it wasn't that he wasn't doing a good job or he got too old to work. These young guys come in and don't need him any longer. This is not part of the teaching of Daniel, but I think it illustrates an important point that we need to be careful. You need to be careful as younger people. I still like to consider myself young. You need to be careful as younger people that when you get a chance to have responsibility, you don't dismiss the wise advice that older people can give you. And it doesn't mean that they can do everything they once did. In our Department of Bible Exposition until last 2 years, Dr. Pentecost and Dr. Toussaint were kind of our patron saints over there in Stearns. And they didn't come to many committee meetings, but they always showed up at our department meeting. And I would always ask them their opinion. And they would often give us some history, which was helpful to know, why are we teaching Gospels in 2 credits? Why don't we have 3 credits? Well, there's an explanation for it. Why are we teaching historical books in 2 credits rather than 3 credits? Why don't we have a course that they once had minor prophets and the Gospels in one course? And why they divide? So this is helpful. This man is dismissed. Why? He's proud. He's not going to listen to anybody else. The queen, that's the word. However, it could mean queen mother. And if this is, he talks about his father, that is his ancestor Nebuchadnezzar. It's actually his grandfather had this man. And this man, verse 12, whom the king calls Belteshazzar, was found to have keen mind, knowledge, understanding, ability to interpret dreams, explain riddles, solve difficult problems. Call Daniel. He'll tell you what the writing means. And because he's desperate, he calls Daniel. And Daniel takes a look at what's on the wall. He realizes what it is because God gives him insight. But before Daniel gives him what he wants to hear, interpretation, Daniel uses this as a teachable moment and says, verse 18, O king, the Most High God gave your father Nebuchadnezzar sovereignty and greatness and glory and splendor. Because of the high position, he gives them a little history lesson. And he ends with, but 20, when his heart became arrogant and was hardened with pride, he was deposed from his royal throne and stripped of his glory. Verse 22, but you, his son, O Belshazzar, have not humbled yourself, though you knew all this. And here in the book of Daniel, it's put right next to it. It's the peak of the chiastic structure. Nobody should be arrogant and proud before the Lord, even if you're the king of the greatest empire on earth at that time. You acknowledge God. The prophets expect everybody to acknowledge God and to treat people properly. That's the rules that they're under. And if you don't, you become arrogant to think that you are the greatest. Look for teachable moments with people that you are with, sometimes with your unbelieving friends. Ask God to give you insight. Sometimes it's when they're having difficulty that you have a teachable moment. When my son was quite small, kindergarten, he came home and said, "Daddy, the boys are talking about mummies and babies." I think this is a teachable moment, right? The birds and bees, here we come. So we had a little talk, and I explained to him, none of the boys in your class have ever made a baby, so they don't really know what they're talking about. I know what I'm talking about, son, because I've made 3 babies. So here's what happens. Daddies sleep with mummies in the same bed, and sometimes God puts then a baby in mummy's tummy, and 9 months later the baby is born. Do you have any questions? No questions at all. A week later, I said, "Now Joshua, Daddy is going away for the weekend. If you get scared, you can go in bed and sleep with Mummy." Big eyes. Says, "We don't want her to have another baby, do we?" Because all I had said was, sleep in the same bed. So now I had to take it one step further and explain a little bit more. A couple weeks later, we're sitting at table, another teachable moment. He said, "Daddy, what's so dangerous about sex?" Dead silence in the room. My girls are just like 8 and 10, but they know sex is not what you talk about at the dining room table. And there's Joshua with this innocent face looking up. What's so dangerous about sex? So, of course, I'm a brilliant communicator, so I repeated the question to give myself time to get it. I said, "So you want to know what's so dangerous about sex?" And then he said, "Yeah, bugs and spiders and sex." He said, "What's so dangerous about them?" I said, "Insects. You want to know what's bugs and spiders and insects?" I said, "I can tell you what's so dangerous about insects." All of that B&M or whatever has kind of disappeared from my mind. I'm thinking, isn't it glad that I asked him to clarify that? You need to be careful. There will be opportunities for you to speak. Make sure that you understand. Daniel knows what's going on here. No doubt, because of, he's already had the dream of chapter 7. Daniel has. He's already had this. He's got the dream from chapter 2 that never, he knows that another kingdom is coming. And he takes opportunity to explain to him, though you've not humbled yourself, verse 22, and you've set yourself up against the Lord of heaven. You've had the goblets from his temple brought to you. You've been drinking, you've been praising the gods of gold and silver and bronze and iron, wood and stone, which can't see or hear or understand, but you've not honored the God who holds in your hand your life and all your ways. He has offered anybody who will tell him the dream, or the meaning of the handwriting, that they'd be third ruler in the kingdom. Daniel explains, many, many tekel parsin. This is what it means. Mene means God is numbering. God's counting. God's counting. And he repeats that twice. 1, 2, 3, 1, 2. God's counted. And you know what? You're not enough. Tekel or shekel, we often would say, you've been weighed in the scales and you've been found wanting. Shekel is a weight. So a silver shekel is a certain weight of silver. And in those days they had scales, and you would put a weight on one side and you'd put the whatever you were seeking to weigh on the other side to see if they balanced out. And he said, "You're too light. You're too light." In Peres or Parson, your kingdom is divided, and it will be given to the Medes and Persians. Now we know what kingdom will follow the head of gold, the Babylonians. It'll be the kingdom of the Medes and Persians. And at Belshazzar's command, Daniel was clothed in purple. Purple is extremely extremely difficult to create as a dye in the ancient world. They think that it probably came from a little sea creature where they got one little drop, so you had to have a lot of it. So it was not a common color that was available for the average person, or it came from a plant. Remember, Lydia in the New Testament is a seller of purple, but she comes from the interior part of modern-day Turkey, Asia Minor. So I don't think it was a sea creature that created it. So it's probably, the purple was probably from some sort of plant, and she's over in Philippi selling this. And so purple was usually reserved for royalty or the high class. And a gold chain was placed around his neck, probably with some sort of medallion on it to show who he was, or at least the value. And he was proclaimed third highest ruler in the kingdom. Do you think Daniel wanted these? Daniel's just said, tonight, enemy are breaking through the gate. I'm not wanting standing there saying, and I'm third ruler of this kingdom as you come in through the gate. So I don't know if Daniel took it off or whatever. That very night, October 12th, 539 BC, Belshazzar, king of the Babylonians, was slain. And Darius the Mede took over the kingdom at the age of 62. There is some historical material that you can develop here. It says Darius the Mede took over. In other places, who is the king? Cyrus the Persian. And so there appears to be, Cyrus appears to be perhaps the king over these two kingdoms. He's the overall, but Darius may have been the king who actually conquered the city of Babylon and took over that part. Later on, there will be another Darius who comes along. If you want to know about Darius, there is a 300-page dissertation in our library that will give you more than you ever wanted to know about Cyrus and Darius. An excellent dissertation by Stephen Anderson. But right now, it's Darius. Daniel's there in that city. And he goes on to explain what happened to Daniel. Daniel, God in his grace, preserves Daniel, even though he had been working for the Babylonians and had given them this warning. Perhaps they heard that there was a man who warned the Babylonians that the Medes and Persians would win. And he is now appointed as an administrator. And Daniel distinguished himself, verse 3, among the administrators and satraps by his exceptional qualities. The king planned to set him over the whole kingdom. The others are jealous. Can you imagine some 80-year-old guy outperforming you? You're younger. You've got more energy. You work longer. But this guy here is just brilliant. And they were jealous, and so they sought to go after Daniel. They were not able to find any corruption in him because he was trustworthy and neither corrupt nor negligent. I love that. He didn't do anything wrong, and he was not even negligent. He did what he was supposed to do. I often speak to Christians, and I wonder if they're good examples at their place of business. If a company is paying you for 60 minutes worth of work, how much time of that should you be spending on your iPhone? Really nothing. They have paid you for that time. You owe them the time. Now, if the company comes along and says, look, we want you to be a security guard here, and when you've done your job, you can read theology, well, praise God. But until then, it's really not fair, and especially if they're a Christian boss. Don't take advantage of them. Peter has something to say about that in the New Testament. See, a lot of Christians think because their boss is Christian, he should understand that they need to leave early to get to a Bible study. And he says, man, since you're working for a fellow brother, you ought to work even harder for him. In Christian organizations, we need to be careful that we're not negligent. We may not actually do anything wrong, but we could be negligent. Some of you guys are going to be in the pastorate in a smaller church. And when you're a pastor in a smaller church, there's really nobody that you're accountable to. No one to keep an eye on you. You can actually drift in at 10 o'clock in the morning, as long as your secretary doesn't squeal on you. And you can drift in at 10 o'clock in the morning. You can take 2 hours lunches. You can golf with the deacons of the next church over, or the pastor of the next. If you're not careful, you could not give a full day's or full week's labor for what they are paying you for. And I think we need to be very, very careful about this as Christians. The interesting thing about Daniel, we don't have anything negative said about him in the scriptures. And he was a hard worker. I think you need to be very, very careful if you're working for someone to ask them what your responsibilities are and how you're to use your extra time when perhaps you've completed your work or whatever. We have had companies in the area. One was a Christian company, Interstate Batteries actually, who when one of our students a few years ago applied, they hired him, but they took him aside and said, you need to understand we've not had good experience with DTS students here. They said what we find is they're forever, they've got these little cards, little mantra cards that they flip through, you know what I mean? They're prayers or something, they're Greek cards, okay? You know what I mean? And they're going through, and they're trying to do that when they're supposed to be working. That's wrong, that's wrong. Daniel didn't do anything wrong, and he wasn't even negligent. I just love that. We'll never find anything except it has to do with the law of his God. And you know the story, how Daniel is caught because they go to the king and they say, everybody's agreed to this, which was a lie. Daniel had not. The trouble is we'll discover both extra-biblical, but in the Bible, in the book of Esther and other places, that the Medes and Persians had a certain standard. That is, when a king makes a decree, it could not be backed up. It couldn't be unvoted. It's the law of the Medes and Persians. And so what they just did is they say, if we made this law, it stands. They can make additional laws, but they can't undo that law. So when they made the law that people could come and kill the Jews, he couldn't undo it, despite what Esther said. But what he did make was another law that said, you Jews ought to know that this day's coming, you're allowed to defend yourself, and you won't be held guilty if you defend yourself. So the law of Medes and Persians was so exact, and now the king discovers that he has been fooled. He likes Daniel, planned to put him in a position of power. Daniel goes home to his home, his upstairs room where the windows open towards Jerusalem. 3 times a day he got down on his knees, which really teaches you we should be having devotions 3 times a day, right? Be careful about taking a descriptive statement and making it prescriptive. Okay? There are prescriptive elements that say you should be in fellowship with the Lord. In the Psalms it says morning and evening. Now it's 3 times a day. There are some Christians who believe that if you haven't had your devotions before the sun comes up, or at least before you've eaten breakfast, that you're unspiritual. It's just not biblical. Because you experience certain disciplines, spiritual disciplines in your life that have been really, really helpful for you, be very, very careful you don't make laws for other people. Some of you are navigators. You memorize a verse of scripture a day, you review them all the time. It's just amazing. It has helped you tremendously. And you believe that if another person isn't memorizing a verse of scripture a day, they're probably, who knows if they're even a believer or not, you know? No, that's just not true. People learn differently. What I want to know is, are you in fellowship with the Lord? Are you getting His Word into you? Are you praying? I think I told you before, my older brother did his PhD work on a personality test and then interviewed people to find out how they were growing spiritually. And he started to ask one wife about the sermons, and she just started to cry. And my brother was just taken back, and he asked her why she's crying. She said, my husband is my pastor, but I don't get much out of his sermons, and I don't grow that. And she was just very, very hurt. My brother said, how do you go? She said, I need to be with a group of women that we can talk this through. See, what was important was she growing spiritually? And had she found a way? I think it's good to meet corporately to hear the Word of God. But if you need to be with people one-on-one, then that's important. Make sure you do it. For some of you, you have little check marks that you check off the box every day, every chapter that you go through, and that's one of them. For some of you, that would become a very legalistic thing. would actually kind of undermine having fellowship with the Lord. But Daniel did what he had to do. He doesn't have probably much fellowship here. 3 times a day he's at least praying, and we'll discover later on that he knows what Jeremiah has talked about. So perhaps he's reading whatever scrolls he has. Rabbis today have taken this and have told Jewish people, if you don't have a temple, prayers can substitute. Because Daniel didn't have a temple and he prayed towards Jerusalem. That is not biblical to say that, but that's the way a lot of Jewish people today, they cannot keep the laws of the Old Testament because there's no temple there. And therefore, rabbis have said, well, as long as you're praying, that can substitute for it. Prayer isn't a substitute for sacrifice. Daniel was doing what he could do. He wasn't saying you shouldn't have a temple. In fact, he's going to want them to go back. Daniel is thrown into the lion's den. The Lord preserves him. I was found innocent in his sight. That doesn't mean that if a person got eaten by a lion, he was sinful. But Daniel is saying in this particular case, God preserved his life to prove to the other people and to this king that he had not been disloyal. Daniel 3 contains the persecution, supernatural protection, 3 in the fiery furnace. Daniel 6 contains the protection, supernatural protection from Daniel from the lions. There's not even a scratch on him. And it's not because the lions weren't hungry, because when the people who had falsely accused Daniel were thrown in, they were eaten immediately. So Daniel 3, 4, and 5 are parallel. God's kingdom will be an eternal kingdom. He's the King of Kings. Daniel 3 and 6 is God can and will protect his people even in the midst of persecution.